Well, thank you very much for these kind words of introduction. Our first panel on this very full day will I think, set the ground for everything else, because it will lay the foundation for the assessment of what we are talking about. It's entitled The Terrorist Threat. Our first panel is entitled The Terrorist Threat. And I shall introduce the speaker in the order in which they take the word according to our program. Our first speaker will be Martin Miller. He's a professor of Russian and European history at Duke University. He is the author of Kropotkin, then the origins of Russian emigration, Freud in Russia, the foundations of modern terrorism, and this of course is the work that would interest us today mostly. And Professor Miller will speak about the topic from the Greensboro massacre in 1979 to the war on terror in 2000, the dynamics of entangled political violence, and we shall be introduced to the historical continuity from the violence of the 1960s to the emergence of jihadi terror that is still with us today. And also, I think we will shine a light on the simultaneity of secular or ideologically motivated terrorism and religiously grounded justifications for terrorism. Then we will hear from Cori from UNC, and her topic is terrorism and visual propaganda in the online space. We will look at the results of the democratization of the ability to produce high-quality moving images, and how social media have helped to weaponize the internet for propaganda videos that are designed and constructed to capture young minds. And of course, Cori is with us at UNC-Chapel Hill. She is a professor of communications. She is the co-editor of Visual Propaganda and Extremism in the Online Environment. She has been the visiting research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute of the US Army War College. Her research focuses on communications strategies of terrorist groups, with a particular focus on their use of visual imagery. Her work has been published in journals such as the Military Review, jihadideology.net, and Dr. Dauber holds a PhD from Northwestern University and MA from UNC-Chapel Hill. Our final speaker in this panel will be Deborah Weissman. She is the Reeve Ivy Second Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Among other courses, Professor Weissman teaches the Human Rights Policy Lab. In addition to her scholarly publications, she is the co-author with her students on several human rights policy briefs that including Understanding Accountability of Torture, the Domestic Enforcement of International Human Rights Treaties, Assessing Recent Developments, Achieving Accountability for Torture, Obligations and Obstacles, Holding North Carolina Accountable for Extraordinary Rendition and Torture, and in 2013 she received the Frank Porter Graham Award from the North Carolina American Civil Liberties Union for outstanding civil rights work. And this already sets the stage for her topic, namely holding North Carolina, the state, and maybe even private entities in North Carolina accountable for things they have done over the last couple of years under the expanded extraordinary rendition laws, which include abduction and transportation beyond the reach of law, interrogation by means of torture, and how this jives with international treaties, and how those actors are held accountable or not held accountable. This sets the stage for our panel, and everyone has about 20-25 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. And I urge all of us to speak up, including me, because everything is recorded, and you should either hold the microphone or have it fairly closely to your body. I think Klaus urges us to really hold it if that doesn't bother you or interfere with your presentation. very well. Martin, the word goes to you.
Thank you very much.
It's a difference.
Do I repeat everything?
Yes.
Good morning, thank you for coming. Let me relate a brief story, which is quite appropriate. I was parking my car on the way to the Newman Center with Holger and Lily, which I wouldn't have found without her, closer to this. In the midst of traveling from here to there, I was flashed by a police car from behind, pulled over. I thought, how appropriate for this panel. It all worked out, I'm here. I was in the wrong name, not knowing you.
Did you get a ticket?
No, he was very sweet. So I'll just read this through, and if you're going to throw things at me, wait until the end, please. My purpose in this talk is to provide historical context and analytic framework as a prelude to the work done by the contributors to this conference on contemporary transnational terrorism. Let me first outline briefly how I understand the term terrorism, and then proceed to discuss the pathways to the war on terror, which continues to dominate our foreign and domestic policies a decade and a half after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The majority opinion on defining terrorism as violent assaults by militants on state and society has been prevalent for over a century. The enemy has altered over time, but there has always been a new threat to provide the term with continuing relevance. 100 years ago, the terrorists were anarchists, a number of whom actually succeeded in assassinating more heads of state within a few decades prior to the Great War than at any other time in modern Western history. 50 years ago, the terrorists were communists, who we were assured threatened the very stability of capitalist societies across the world. Today, the terrorists are Muslim fanatics committing atrocities in the name of global jihad. Government counter-terrorists do make mistakes on occasion in combating these dangers, but have their society's protective interests at heart. On the other hand, militants kill innocents and thus are essentially engaged in political crimes. In reality, this transnational narrative, propagated from Moscow to Washington in various modes, is only partially accurate. Missing from the analysis is the fact that governments and their security services, excluding wars, have been responsible for exponentially higher mortality rates than the combined totals of all militant organizations in modern history. The Paris Commune of 1871 alone was responsible from 20,000 to 40,000 deaths within a single week. These victims were primarily the people we call innocents living in the vicinity of the Hôtel de Ville, where the Commune's command force operated. And the slaughter was ordered and sponsored by a newly minted democratic republic, not an imperial dictatorship. During the Latin American dirty wars of the 1960s and 70s, tens of thousands of presumed and actual victims were tortured, disappeared, and murdered by the state security forces. And this does not include either of the 20th century world wars or the crimes of Hitler and Stalin. In the United States, government forces, with the participation of local vigilantes, murdered at least 10,000 Native Americans during the politely named Indian removal of the 1830s. Indeed, a recent study has called the destruction of native tribes in 19th century California a genocide. Similarly, at least 8,000 African Americans were lynched, often amidst public celebrations in broad daylight in this country between the end of the Civil War and the start of the Second World War, all of which had local government participation. Both of these campaigns against Indians and blacks were instances of state terrorism with casualties far beyond the number of victims perpetrated by militant terrorist groups. My point is simply that we should consider the entangled interaction of state security forces together with militant groups in historical moments of violent combat as a more accurate way to comprehend the enduring reality of terrorism. In all of the cases that I have studied, the one permanent theme motivating the violence is the contestation over the legitimacy of political authority. Governments often resort to force to maintain their power when they are challenged, and militants seek to undermine what they consider illegitimate authority with tactics of violence. Terrorism occurs when these currents collide simultaneously. The wave of political violence that dominated the 1960s and 70s reflects the dynamics of this confrontation. The Algerian National Liberation Front battled French security forces to achieve independence, and in the process inspired a raft of imitative militant organizations worldwide. The manner in which the two sides tactically resembled each other produced escalating modes of force and increasing numbers of victims. The African National Congress confronted the apartheid regime in South Africa. The Shin Bet led the fight against the PLO in Palestine. The Ulster Volunteers competed with the IRA and against the IRA, as well as against the British Constabulary in Ireland during the period known as the Troubles. The ruthless state forces of President Fujimori eventually overwhelmed the terrorism of Sendero Luminoso in Peru. The Red Brigades in Italy and the Baader-Meinhof group in West Germany were also brought down by overwhelming state force. And with the end of the Vietnam War, the Weathermen and the Black Panthers found themselves in the United States isolated and finally liquidated by the combined power of the CIA and the FBI. Arguments remain as to when the modes of terrorism employed in the decade of the violent 60s came to a decisive conclusion. One of the overlooked events that I believe was the actual final spasm of this Cold War format of ideological violence was the Death to the Klan march sponsored by the Communist Workers' Party on November 3, 1979 in Greensboro, North Carolina. An alliance of representatives of the Klan and the American Nazi Party promised to confront the demonstrators. Because the police were instructed to, quote, take a long lunch, they were not present at the scene to play what should have been a protective role. As a result, the Klan opened fire on the unarmed protesters, killing 5 and wounding another 10 people, after which they drove off entirely unapprehended. The media did not cover the event properly because that same day, the American embassy in Tehran was taken over. Nevertheless, the ideologically motivated 60s had come to an end with that event. The next wave, however, had already been in progress, though its contours were somewhat dissimilar from its predecessor. With the Soviet Union limping toward collapse and finally expiring in 1991, the US remained as the sole global superpower. Paradoxically, this status made it more rather than less vulnerable as a target for a new generation of militants, and its reach extended accordingly. With the diffusion of globalization, this vulnerability became a liability, requiring aggressive protection. Precisely because American interests expanded dynamically and rapidly into the space vacated by the demise of the Soviet Union's domain, the US symbolically and realistically offered fresh opportunities for militant attacks far beyond its territorial boundaries, but still within its newly fashioned extraterritorial interests. The former zone of conflict continued to exist, but now the latter was added. Perhaps the most glaring example of the continuation of the next thematic phase of domestic terror was the bombing of the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995. 168 people were killed and 650 were wounded. The perpetrator, Timothy McVeigh, was a member of the nationalist Michigan militia and a veteran of the Gulf War in Iraq. In his truck, police found a copy of the Turner Diaries, a fictional account of the overthrow of the United States government, accompanied by a vicious and victorious race war against African Americans. What is most interesting was the government's immediate response to this tragedy before McVeigh was apprehended. Accompanied by reporters, the local police, together with National Guard recruits, essentially invaded the Muslim community of Oklahoma City, searching for people they assumed to be responsible. After all, only 2 years before, on February 26, 1993, Americans confronted the domestic attack on the World Trade Center in New York that was organized by Ramzi Youssef, who had trained in an al-Qaeda camp and whose uncle was the notorious militant Khalid Muhammad. His justification? This act was a reprisal for the American support of Israel's terrorist policies against the Palestinians. Few could imagine at that time that a second attempt would be made against the same target and would succeed in achieving the utter destruction of the Trade Center and 3,000 of its employees only 8 years later. Abroad, the fury against the US and its global interests continued to accelerate. There are many facets and locations to make sense of this conflict between the US and its militant antagonists, but a glance at the longue durée in Iran may shed relevant light. Most Americans know about the 1979 takeover of the US Embassy in Tehran. but few are aware of the 1953 events that it sought to rectify. On August 19th that year, the CIA sponsored a series of street demonstrations designed to sabotage the stability of the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was seen as leaning too close to Moscow. One of the militants encouraged by the CIA who joined the violent street riots was a theologian named Ruhollah Khomeini, later to become the first Ayatollah of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In place of the Mossadegh administration, the United States installed Reza Pahlavi as the ruling Shah, whose Savak secret police force terrorized Iran for over 2 decades. Another example of the terrorist scene change occurring toward the tail end of the Cold War was the U.S. support of Saddam Hussein in Iraq during its decade-long war with Iran. Yet another was the support of Osama bin Laden, who volunteered to join the Mujahideen force, again with American tactical and financial support, in the war against the Soviet puppet state in Afghanistan during the 1980s. In this period between the collapse of Cold War ideologically motivated violence and its apparent replacement by religiously inspired terrorism, the employment of tactical force to achieve politically strategic goals reflected a significant concurrent trend, namely, the shift from national to international combat. The sites of the violence of the Cold War 60s were predominantly within national, spatial, and geopolitical boundaries. To mention several of the most feared militant groups at the time who confronted the police in their own countries. The Baader-Meinhof group operated almost exclusively in West Germany. The Red Brigades did their work in Italy. The Weathermen and the Black Panthers operated in the US, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Danny Le Rouge, led the violent demos against the Paris police during the 1968 confrontations that almost toppled the French government. The next wave of international and transnational terrorism was already in motion, though largely still episodic and secondary by counter-terrorist strategies. One emerging theme was the tendency to assign the U.S. with responsibility for regional problems because it was perceived as, and often acted as, the gendarme du monde. The tactics of airline hijackings by the PLO, Hezbollah's blowing up of the U.S. military compound in Lebanon, the 1988 Lockerbie plane destruction, the attacks on American embassy buildings in Kenya and Tanzania, and on the USS Cole are only some of the most newsworthy items of the time. Because American interests were now global, the representations of those interests were increasingly regarded as targets worldwide. For groups who turn to tactical violence to achieve political goals, whether in government or against it, there must be an enemy force. The central problem is the question of political legitimacy and the imposition of state power. Regardless of intentionality, perceptionality is often more significant for both sides. Without understanding the culture of the antagonist, state leaders as well as militants advocate violence as a solution to what are often real problems for which blame and responsibility must be placed elsewhere, to the other. Bin Laden declared war on the U.S. by painting a self-serving and unrealistic portrait of a satanic people. The U.S. went into battle in Afghanistan without knowing how to speak the native language of Pashtun to the people whom they were allegedly protecting. Not to mention the destructive conflict in Iraq based on false intelligence about the presence of weapons of mass destruction. In these and most of the other instances of terrorism in the current era of jihadist violence, both of the combatants have been, and continue to be, motivated by the drive to overcome the counterclaims of political legitimacy. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and whatever future organizations morph from the current crisis are committed to the sabotaging of the American system of governance and its international interests. At the same time, U.S. security forces are employed to eliminate the competing claims of legitimacy advocated by its enemies. This is the essence of the entangled nature of the violence that defines a terrorist moment. Both sides have a stake in the outcome, and competing forms of violence are employed to achieve some version of victory. In our time, the terrain of battle has expanded. The weapons employed have become ever more deadly, and the justifications with regard to militants challenging state legitimacy appear to have changed from ideological to theological over the course of several decades. The underlying motivations for the violent confrontations, however, which concern long-standing issues concerning problems resulting from conditions of unendurable poverty, economic exploitation, colonializing racism, and discourses that speak past rather than to one another, continue to persist. The current wave of terrorism is not, in Samuel Huntington's memorable phrase, a clash of civilizations, but rather, more accurately, a confrontation between a set of religiously committed organizations seeking to achieve political legitimacy and transatlantic secularized nation-states driven by spiritually inspired passions to maintain that very legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miller, for reminding us that one side's terrorists is the other side's freedom fighters. And in this space of contestation, we are all asked to choose sides, and you refuse to do that. And I think this will be quite a topic of conversation and discussion after we have heard from all the other presenters. And also thank you for sticking to our time limit so nicely, which frees up time for all the rest of us at the end. We will now hear from Cori Dauber from the UNC-Chapel Hill campus and Department of Communications. And her topic is terrorism and visual propaganda in the online space.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us together on this topic, which I believe is very important. And I'm very excited to be able to share with you the work that we're doing at UNC regarding the evaluation of terrorist video. I think that it's worth taking a quick minute just to put into context the claim that you've probably heard that ISIS, the Islamic State, is a generation ahead of other groups when it comes to visual propaganda. And the easiest way to do that is by just taking a quick look back. So if you go back about 10 years, most groups that had a web presence, which by then was most terrorist groups, were beginning to integrate video into their web presence, even if in a relatively primitive way. So this is a cut of a Taliban video from about 2006, and you can see it's overexposed, the f-stop is visible, and most of all, the guy who's holding the camera has no clue whatsoever where to point the camera. Right? This is what happens when you give Grandpa a video camera for the first time. Right? Do I look at the mountain? Do I look at the sky? Do I look at the other guys that are with me? So that's from about 2006. Now, at around the same time, Al-Qaeda, like Al-Qaeda, the original group, were years ahead of everybody else. So much so that even if they had not had logos burned onto their materials, it was fairly easy to identify their stuff when you saw it on the web. And one of the ways you could identify their stuff is that around that time, they were pretty much the only group that was beginning to integrate computer-animated graphics at a fairly sophisticated level. I said sophisticated, not subtle. Now, the thing about Al-Qaeda, however, is that while they were years ahead, they stayed fairly static for a fairly long period of time. So that's from 2006. Within 4 years, they're beginning to be outpaced. So what I've done here is put next to one another the graphics from the BBC, obviously, next to the graphics from the group that purported to represent Shabab, which is Al-Qaeda's Somali affiliate. And the idea for lining these up came from one of our students. And it's genius, because when you line the two groups up, you can see immediately that the design aesthetic is a straight rip, right? That is just too close to be anything accidental. Now, but though the Islamic State materials have been far superior than any of this stuff, they are not uniform. So here at UNC, we've been carefully evaluating IS video and categorizing them. So this is pretty much what you'd expect. It's the way people talk about ISIS, the Islamic State, about their materials. Very sophisticated, more high-end than any other group, and evidence of a great deal of centralization in production. But then, at around the time when Coalition Air Campaign gets really serious, production is radically decentralized, and no surprise, quality begins to crater. And just so you know, we're not making these judgments in an ad hoc kind of way. We do have a relatively methodical and systematic way of evaluating these videos, which I'd be happy to talk to you about during the Q&A if you're interested. But in any event, we look at this, we see the quality crater, and our initial thought was, good news, quality's going down. And if you care about online propaganda, the one thing you'd like to see out of a kinetic campaign is quality crater. The problem is, it was not long before we began to see evidence of recovery, right? The quality begins to come back up. And what we realized was, the members of the original core team are pushed out to the boonies, at which point they're forced to work with babies, with young media makers, or puppies as I call them. Now, like all young media makers, they're beginning to produce materials, the technical term for which would be, bad. Their stuff was bad. But also, like all young media makers, they improve rapidly. The quality comes up in fits and starts, right? There's a lot of plateaus, but the quality comes up very quickly. The lesson of all of this is, if your goal is to take out media production, you can't cripple it, you've got to destroy it. Because if you're leaving people behind who know how to do the production, they'll just start working with other people and they'll train them how to do it. Now, I want to give some quick examples of all of this to make it easier to see the differences that we're talking about. So, the case study for that first period dropped only days after Baghdadi pronounced the caliphate. You might think of it as peak ISIS. If you're interested in the production of these groups, you've probably seen this video. It's gotten a lot of attention. A number of people have written about it. Now, there's a lot that's sophisticated about this video. But the thing that's always caught my attention about it is the camera angle, right? It's first person or subjective camera angle. In other words, it's designed to give you the impression that you're looking through your own eyes, right? It's supposed to be your hands holding the bag. And you're meant to think that it's your eyes walking through the market. The camera even sways a little bit. I may be talking ahead of where we're at in the video. Sorry, I can't see. So the camera even sways a little bit to give the impression that you're walking, right? Now the thing is, it's designed to look chaotic, but there is nothing accidental about the way this thing is set up. So you notice that as you're, quote, walking, this big chaotic crowd parts to create just enough space for you to walk through. The other thing that's striking is, every time fighters show up, their faces are in one way or another obscured. So these guys' back is to the camera. In a minute, when you see other fighters, their faces are in shadow. And that, I think, is critical to why this works. The point of this as a recruitment video is to invite you to imagine yourself there. And if they show specific faces, that's much more difficult. If the faces are obscured, it's easier for you to picture yourself in that place, right? So that's the case study for the first one. Case study for the second phase clearly demonstrates the drop in quality. So we've got a couple of cuts here to show what's going on with this one. Initially, notice that they're using the big boom and then the dust to show the size of the explosion. And then the guy pulls the lanyard and the gun goes off and there's dust. The guy pulls the lanyard, gun goes off and there's dust. Wait, stop me if you've heard this one. The guy pulls the lanyard, and on and on and on. It's very repetitive. Now the second section, when we initially saw it, we thought the quality was so low it was very reminiscent of the earliest videos from Al-Qaeda. Grainy, it's off in the distance. Watch the truck. Watch the truck. Watch the truck. Not that truck. Now, a good editor, and Mark Robinson, who does this work with me, is here today. Mark has done editing for Oscar winners. I don't mean a good editor like Mark. I mean a good editor like me who does a lot of editing for videos to drop into course slides. A good editor would have cut that by 50%, right? Now, then there's this guy. Now they want this guy because of what he's saying. But the guy holding the camera can't figure out how to frame the shot. And so in the side, you see this other guy's forehead? So he realizes he's doing it wrong. He moves the camera around. So look on the other side. All of a sudden, there's an elbow that jumps into the scene. Now he knows he's doing it wrong and he gives up entirely. And so what he does is he just pulls back. Right? And that's without even talking about things like lighting, and there's just a bunch of other ways where this is obviously of lower quality than the first video, right? So, now, to show that the quality starts to come back up. The edits here are rough, but look at, for example, the color saturation. It reflects something called the rule of thirds. Mark could explain the math to you. I don't do anything with math. But the guy is off to the side, which makes it much more appealing visually, right? Then, again, the rule of thirds. But while he's speaking, there's this other footage that's going to come in. Now, this is relatively high-end footage, right? You see how high-res it is. But he continues to speak in order to give you the sense that the videographer is panned behind, right? That's not actually how it was produced, which means that there's a sophistication in terms of both video and audio editing that the second group could not have dreamt of. And then to close the loop, they go back to the guy, right? There's just a huge jump in sophistication here. Now, how are they going to prove that the roads and the bridges are back up and running? Well, they show you a bridge using the vanishing point. We're not crazy. We understand this is not professional quality video, but it's again just a huge jump up. And finally, you notice this bustling market, and they're pulling your eye along. They're pulling your eye. They're pulling your eye. They're pulling your eye, boom, until your eye meets his, right? Again, there's just an enormous jump in quality. Now, what this proves is not only that they can reconstitute, but they now are aware of the fact. They know that they can reconstitute. In fact, despite the military pressure we all know Islamic State has been under, and the collapse of the territorial state, not only have they continued to push out product, but they have continued to improve in quality. Now, what no one has been talking about is that it's not just foreign fighters who will disperse. It's also their media production teams who are going to disperse, which seems to us to be a fairly urgent issue. So as late as October 1st, so that's a couple of weeks ago, right? What were they down to at that point? A couple of hundred guys clustered in downtown Raqqa? They were putting out quality this good. Listen, on their best day, the North Carolina Tourism Bureau could not compete with that, right? Mark said to me yesterday, he said, yeah, but Florida and California probably could. Okay, fair enough. But I mean, that's pretty good for people who are losing control of all of their territory. Now, to be sure, a single-minded focus on IS is extremely dangerous. If only because some of those guys won't just go back to their home countries, they'll jump ship to other groups, some of which already are producing material that is competitive. So just very briefly, this is all about editing and camera angles, but this is from militia groups in Syria. That camera angle gets me every time. I just think that is so well done. So what was our response? I can only speak to what came out from the United States, but to me it's no surprise that it had so little effect. So some of you may be familiar with what was the Think Again, Turn Away campaign that the State Department put out. A series of videos that simply could not compete in terms of quality. So let me just give you a quick random selection. If you've been watching those videos, if you're a kid, you're not even going to click when you see those graphics, right? Now, I am a huge believer in the power of still images, right? It doesn't have to be moving images to be effective, but they've got to be good stills, and they've got to be the right stills. As for instance, if your argument is that they're blowing up mosques, how about you use the after and not the before? What is that? I mean, that is crazy to me. And it's particularly nuts given that other videos that State Department used did in fact prove that they were blowing up mosques. I mean, this is mystifying. All right, so back to where we left off. Now, if you're an English speaker, your eyes are going to be pulled to the bottom third because that's where the subtitles are. If you're an Arabic speaker, your eyes are pulled to the bottom third because that's where the color is, right? The mic covers are colored. So let me ask, raise your hand if you saw the inset. Yeah, maybe a third. So let's watch that last 9 seconds again. He's talking about a suicide bombing. They've got the images of the suicide bombing and they put it in the one space you're least likely to look. Shocking that we didn't stop more foreign fighters from going over to I mean, this is... So what would an effective response look like? To answer that question, we considered an element, particularly in Islamic State video, that we believe has not gotten sufficient attention. In constructing their materials, IS often uses images and memes that are designed to appeal not to a specific ethnic group or nationality, but to a youth culture that is increasingly globalized. So here's the thing. I've realized that I can't, with confidence, analyze their videos anymore until I've shown them to a couple of 20-year-olds. Because the risk that I'm going to miss something important is just too high. Now, luckily, I happen to work with 18 and 20-year-olds, so I'm covered. The point where this really became apparent to me was after the Paris attacks. So 2 weeks after Paris, the video drops, and it's got an anchor image, because they realized it was so good and so important, they repeat the image a couple of times. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, God, I knew these guys were good, but this is a level of CGI. I had no idea that they had that capacity. So I took it in and I showed it to my class. Let me quickly show you the image that I'm talking about. So I showed that to my students and bemoaned the fact that Islamic State had just taken this huge leap forward in technology. And a bunch of my kids went, Dr. Dauber, they didn't do that. So let me ask, how many of you recognize the original source material for that? Because you're too old. You've aged out of being able to recognize it. The source material for that is the movie G.I. Joe, Rise of the Cobra. Rise of the Cobra. They are straight ripping Marvel's superhero movies. Now, look, we have to watch these videos with all of these horrible things. That's just part of the job. That's what we do. I am not also going to watch superhero movies, okay? There's a limit. So we've got to have the kids tell us what's going on with this stuff, because they recognize this material. It's designed for them and it's from them. Last year, right around this time, was a video that dropped, homage to the snipers of the Islamic State. So, all right, now I'm getting smart about this stuff, right? I posted it to my class website with a request, would the gamers please watch the video and help me out? Now this was brought to us by a graduate student in the history department who we were working with. He brought it to us because he recognized that all the snipers in the video were actually Americans. They had ripped a History Channel documentary. So they're showing American snipers and then they're CGIing in the bullets. So it looks like this. All right? So anyway, so I post the video to my class website, ask the gamers to take a look at it for me. The next time I come into class, there's like 20 kids standing by the podium. They're like vibrating. They're so excited. Call of Duty. They didn't rip it from Call of Duty, but they mimicked Call of Duty. Whoops. Like so. So our idea has been the concept for the response campaigns has got to come from kids, right? Now, we don't think you leave them alone to do the campaigns because, again, young media makers, right? They've got to have adults there as sounding boards. They've got to have adults there to help them tweak and put the things together, and et cetera, et cetera. But they've got to drive the concepts. So we did this experimental course with a number of kids. We took my students who had studied the messaging campaigns, Mark's students who had studied production. This is an example of the work that came out of that class. Now, a class, right, and only 3 weeks. So the materials that were produced could not be taken live. They need additional scrubs. But that's an example of what came out from that. And I think I have just enough time to show you this. So I realize we're having a problem with the volume. I don't know how well you could hear that, but the shots of the road are filmed in Minneapolis, St. Paul by one of my students who had no production background. She checked a GoPro out of the lab. She conned her mom into driving her around town. She's hanging out of the side of the car. Not that I would recommend such reckless driving behavior, I'm just saying. So while she's shooting that at home, our production students were shooting the much slicker, more high-end stuff. The point of that, I don't know if you could hear the script, but it's designed to be scalable, right? There's no mention in the script of jihad or Islam or anything like that. So a community center, there's no community center, even if they can't afford a GoPro, that doesn't have somebody with a cell phone that shoots video. You drive around your own neighborhood, you shoot the video of your own neighborhood, you can re-record the voiceover in your own accents or dialect or even language. And if you're worried about extremists recruiting your kids who are Klan or neo-Nazis, it still works. If you're worried about gangs recruiting your kids, it still works. It doesn't matter what you think the threat to your youth is, the script still works. And because you can edit in the footage from your own neighborhood by shooting around your own streets, you can integrate it into your own community and make the campaign your own. The end.
Dauber, thank you very much. I thought the least fanatics, fundamentalists, terrorists the KKK understands is humor. And I found it very relieving that we had so many very good laughs during your presentation on such a serious matter. This is one way I think one can break the back of these kind of fanatics who do not have sense of humor at all. We keep going with very serious topics, and we move on to Deborah Weissman from the UNC School of Law, and she will talk about other extraordinary measures in the fight against terrorism.
Thank you. So I think I might pick up where our keynote last night mentioned one of the ways in which terrorists set a trap for us, and the consequences of that being the corrosion of values. So this morning I hope to provide an overview of the U.S. government, the CIA's program of rendition, detention, and interrogation, which is a euphemism for extraordinary rendition and torture, following the events of September 11th. And I'll briefly describe the program to you. I will tell you some about the harm that it has caused. I want to specifically draw attention to North Carolina's role in this program. That is the state, its political subdivisions, and an entity called Aero Contractors, which is incorporated in North Carolina and headquartered in Smithfield. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it is we know what we know about North Carolina's role. I'll talk to you a little bit about the laws that apply and what the laws have or have not achieved. And then I'm going to end with a review of our current efforts to gain some accountability in this state for the programs that we participated in. And by way of some context for my remarks, for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been working with UNC law students in the Human Rights Policy Lab that I teach, and we've been working with human rights attorneys, with advocates, with the Council of Europe, with the UN, with a range of with folks in an effort to provide some measure of accountability and relief for torture victims. So you all may know a little bit about the definition of torture. It has a specific and universal definition, and it's found in the Convention Against Torture. I think it's probably worth to revisit that definition because it's a binding definition. It's any act by which suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation or with the consent or acquiescence of public official or other person acting in an official capacity. Extraordinary rendition. It's a program that was part and parcel of this detention and interrogation program where foreign nationals who were suspected of being involved in some form of terrorist acts committed against the United States were captured without due process of law, of any opportunity to to know charges, to obtain an attorney, to contact family. The CIA captured these individuals and transported them covertly through European airspace and airports to what we call dark sites, which are places where the CIA determined international human rights law would not apply or serve as a deterrent. And so some of these sites were fully under U.S. control. So this is the list of the places that the United States controlled: Guantanamo, Bagram, Cobalt, also known as the Salt Pit in Kabul, Abu Ghraib, detention site Green in Thailand, Bright Light Romania, and there are others. And then there are some places that are outside of the U.S. control to where individuals were flown, particularly Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan. We've become particularly familiar with Temara, which is the infamous torture prison in Morocco. There are a number of rendition circuits dropping people off there for torture. Now, North Carolina's role, sorry. For some reason the map was not showing on this, but at least 44 detainees were flown on North Carolina planes. They were flown again by planes operated by aero contractors. 44 is probably a low estimate. There are individuals who are still working with the flight data and other evidence, and so we think the number will grow. One plane had the tail number N379P. It was an aero-operated Gulfstream jet based at the Johnston County Airport, which is a political subdivision of the state. And then there's M313P. That's an aero-operated Boeing business jet that was housed at the North Carolina Global Transport, which is a state-created industrial transportation park. So again, our state tax dollars and efforts have facilitated these what they're called now as torture taxis. The documentation, how do we know what we know? Because it's been so difficult to get information, particularly when we first started this project, we've tried to be very, very, very transparent in our methodology. We obtained an awful lot of information from the lead investigator for the Council of Europe, who shared some of the Council of Europe flight data with us, as well as FAA flight information. The rendition project, which operates out of the UK, also has done some very detailed analyses of these rendition circuits. A number of analyses came out of the Freedom of Information Act and other litigation-produced documents. Of course, there's the 2014 Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, which documented quite a bit about the CIA torture program. The various UN committees and European reports have also documented much of the information that helped us put together this connection with North Carolina. The International Committee of the Red Cross, journalists, plane spotters. And so we put together a report called North Carolina's Connection to Extraordinary Rendition and Torture. And we sent it to the 3 leading experts at the time in Europe for review and endorsement, and did obtain that endorsement, and subsequently learned that the report has been relied upon both by the Department of Defense and by the prosecutor in Milan. And you could find that report. I can tell you where to find it if you're interested during questions and answers. So this is a map that the Council on Legal Affairs and Human Rights for the Council of Europe put together. And what it does is it shows you the various rendition circuits. And you can see how the planes sort of crisscross. North Carolina planes generally flew out of Johnson County, went to Dulles, got their flight patterns and flight instructions, and off they went. So, it's a little bit difficult to talk about extraordinary rendition and torture in terms of really what it does to people. I think that there's no doubt that my students who've read much of the Senate Select report on torture and other narratives suffer a little bit of secondary post-traumatic stress. But we think about what the victims suffered, so it's really important to be reminded of what this torture program entailed. First, let me tell you about the protocols of just the capture, just the extraordinary rendition part. And that involved and this is a protocol, this is how they did it over and over again. The snatch team would actually slice the clothes off of the person who was captured. Ordinarily, they'd be hooded. They were strapped to some sort of board, their chest, their torso, their feet. They were handcuffed. Sometimes they were gagged. Sometimes they were blindfolded. If they were thrown onto aircrafts like meat, like animals, if they squirmed in pain because of the positions that they were in, they were beaten. If their mouths were not taped shut and they asked if they could move, they would then have their mouths taped shut. And various UN committees that monitor these events have declared that extraordinary rendition in and of itself is a violation of the Convention Against Torture. The planes that then were a part of this snatch, this kidnapping, then further facilitated the violation of CAT by delivering these people to interrogation by torture. And they took them to places where a variety of medieval torture techniques were employed. Detainees were kept in complete darkness. They were shackled with blaring loud music. They usually only had a bucket for human waste. They suffered beating, sexual abuse, forced nudity, rectal feeding, including excessive force in this rectal feeding, simulated drowning, hypothermia, painful stress positions, prolonged sensory deprivations, sleep deprivations for up to 180 hours, confinement in small boxes, mock burials, threats to harm family members, and threats of execution. And for those of you who have followed the court-martial of Dauber and his description of what he endured, it's eerily similar to what has happened to these victims according to the CIA rendition and extraordinary and torture program. The consequences: debilitating physical, physiological, and of course psychological harm. Neurological damage, systemic failures. The psychological effects are worse than the physical and physiological effects. It is difficult for victims to even seek any sort of redress. It's not surprising that they suffer major depression, major post-traumatic stress. Many torture survivors experience an existential dilemma. Their whole worldview has completely been undermined, and the long-term effects are generally irreversible. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report again documented much of what we learned in other sources, and the New York Times put together 7 key takeaways from that report, so I'll quickly go through them with you. First, that interrogation techniques were far more brutal and extensively employed than the agency revealed. The interrogation program was mismanaged. The CIA misled Congress and the White House about the effectiveness of these techniques. Interrogators who tried to stop the brutal techniques were overruled by more senior CIA officials. The number of individuals who were tortured were underreported. At least 26, and we would guess there's more, according to the Senate report, should never have even been detained. There was one individual, Khalid el-Masri, who was picked up because they had the wrong man. They were looking for someone else, and even after they knew that, they continued to torture him. And then misclassified, the release of so-called classified information to journalists in a way of sort of drumming up support. In fact, that so-called classified information was misinformation. So none of this is or was legal. And so we know that the prohibition on torture is a binding, customary international law. It is a general principle of law that has been elevated to the plane of a law that knows no exception. Torture is not legally authorized anywhere. And this is not only true with regard to the obligations of the federal government, it's also true with regard to the obligations of the state, its political subdivisions, and juristic entities such as ARROW, particularly because they're so enmeshed in government-type functions that they bear state-like responsibility for human rights violations. We consider the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to be customary international law. It's not a treaty, it's a declaration. But we have never said it does not bind us. We have never said that the principles are not applicable to our own federal and state laws. Declaration is a prohibition against torture. We have signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 7 clearly prohibits torture. We have signed and ratified the Convention Against Torture, the definition of which I just reviewed momentarily a moment ago. But not only does this treaty prohibit torture, it also requires other obligations. Parties to the convention have an obligation to hold those who violate the treaty responsible and to provide reparation and repair. So, given these treaty provisions, what are the challenges in applying them? We've signed and ratified these treaties, and some of you may be familiar with the debates about whether treaties are enforceable or not. We have the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause, which was debated at the time of its drafting and determined after many debates that the states would be bound to the international treaties that the federal government signed. And thus, the clause says, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Pretty clear language. So, if that's our Supremacy Clause, what is the problem with enforcing the ICCPR CAT? Well, the United States, as do many other countries, we add language onto the treaties after we kind of participate in the drafting of the treaties. And these are called reservations, understandings, and declarations, or RUDs for short. And many of the addendums that we add dilute or seek to avoid altogether some of the obligations of these treaties. It seems to be implausible and irrational that you would participate in a treaty body, sign and ratify these treaties, and say, oh, but we really don't mean it. These provisions are not really going to apply. And certainly no part of the treaty will apply unless we pass another federal law saying so, i.e. domesticate the treaty. So whether or not one can add these kinds of reservations, understandings, and declarations is a subject of a whole lot of contentious academic debates. One way to resolve those debates is to look at the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is the treaty of all treaties. And the United States has said repeatedly that this treaty is customary international law and applies to us. And the key principles are that, number one, if you sign a treaty, and if you sign and ratify a treaty, you cannot engage in any action that's taken in opposition to that treaty. And secondly, with regard to a reservation, understanding, and declaration, those reservations must be compatible with the object and the purpose of the treaty. So then to sign a treaty and say, well, we really didn't need it, would be impermissible. And in fact, treaty oversight committees have said as much about our RUDs. So if the Vienna Convention would hold that our efforts to dilute our obligations are improper and effective, again, how do we achieve enforcement? The United States could be ousted altogether, I suppose, from these treaty bodies. I doubt that there's any political will for that action, or that we would really want that to take place, and we would have no obligations, no apparent obligations whatsoever. The problem, as we all know, is that international law is soft law. There's really not much of a way to enforce it concretely, specifically. The mechanisms for enforcing international human rights law are through reporting and monitoring. But I will say that there's nonetheless some usefulness to soft law, because it does over time acquire some sort of legal weight. And in fact, in a number of the recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions on matters that very much bear on human rights, the justices who are writing for the court about those decisions have said that their decisions have been very much influenced by international human rights norms. And so that's why we persevere. That's why we say the academic debates about whether a treaty is self-executing or not cannot stand in the way of what is just sort of common sense when you sign a treaty and enter into those obligations. So we persevere. and we continue to push forward, notwithstanding the challenges of soft law. For the purposes of talking about torture, however, we can actually skip the entire debate about whether treaties are self-enforcing or not. And that's because with regard to the Convention Against Torture, we have domesticated that treaty. We have enacted a number of statutes, some of which specifically are for the purpose of domesticating that treaty. So we have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which prohibits returning someone to a place where their life or liberty is endangered. We have the Torture Victims Protection Act, which is a private right of action for victims of torture. We have the federal torture statute, and that statute specifically was enacted to, quote, bring the United States into compliance with the Convention Against Torture. We have the War Crimes Act. We have the Foreign Affairs and Restructuring Act. We have the Detainee Treatment Act. We have the National Defense and Authorization Act, Section 1045. We have the Alien Tort Statute. So we have all of these statutes that prohibit and make illegal that which we have been engaged in. We have the Eighth Amendment of our Constitution. No cruel and unusual punishment. North Carolina has its own constitutional provisions that would prohibit torture or the taking of life and liberty without due process of law. We have statutes that prohibit kidnapping and some of the same sorts of acts that comprise extraordinary rendition. Those statutes include corporations, and they include the conspiracy to commit these sorts of acts. So again, we have treaties, we have the domestication of these treaties, we have state laws. What has that gotten us? So let me just try to tell you a little bit of good news on the international plane. In December 2014, for the very first time before the UN Committee on Torture, the United States admitted unequivocally that torture prohibition applies everywhere and anywhere without exception. First time. Now that was before the presidential campaign and Donald Trump's promise to bring back waterboarding and to send all the bad dudes to Guantanamo. So I don't know if that really will hold. There have also been a number of really promising decisions out of the European Court of Human Rights and some courts decisions out of the UK and Australia, which have ruled in favor of torture victims who brought claims because of extraordinary rendition and torture. And then in the United States, my students have been seeking relief on behalf of Mr. Bertel. He's an Italian citizen who was captured in Pakistan and delivered to the United States and then rendered to Morocco, where he was tortured horrifically without ever having been associated with any terrorist act or terrorist person. And there's been a little bit of relief coming his way, just by way of acknowledgement. Now, in the U.S. courts, not such good news. We've got two cases, Al-Masri and Muhammad versus Jefferson Data Plan. These two cases were both dismissed on the grounds of state secrets. State secrets is an evidentiary privilege. It is not grounds for dismissing wholesale an entire litigation if the case can proceed without the evidence that's being blocked. However, I would say most scholars on this point would agree that this evidentiary privilege was misused in the name of national security. And it's worth noting that a number of the plaintiffs in both of these lawsuits won their case on the same facts and similar legal theories in the European Court of Human Rights and in the UK. But here's some good news. There's two cases that are recent. The first is Salim versus Mitchell. That was a case that you might have read about. It was brought against the two psychologists who were paid $81 million by the CIA for the development of the torture program. Not only did the judge allow that case to go forward, but it recently settled for what we believe to be huge sums of money. And then this case, which is pretty exciting to me, Al-Shamari versus CACI. It's a case involving Iraqi torture victims who were tortured in Abu Ghraib. It's against the military contractor. Not only, again, has the court allowed that case to go forward, but the court has suggested that there is no way that CACI, as a contractor, could hide behind its claim that it did what it did because the government asked it to do so. So what about North Carolina? We have met or tried to meet with many, many state officials, county officials. We've met with the past two governors and the current governor. We've met with the past Attorney General and the current Attorney General to no avail. We have met with county commissioners, tried to meet with airport authority officials, tried to meet with the county sheriff. So currently we're working with groups to hold a citizens commission of inquiry. And the groups that we've been advising for the past 7 or 8 years got a very generous grant from Open Society to enable the establishment of this commission. I'll tell you about that in just one more moment. I just wanted to make 2 more points about what the experience of investigating the program, the torture, has revealed to us. Some of which may be quite obvious. First, there's a link between our domestic criminal justice system and the so-called war on terror. In the process of our investigation, we had an interview with retired Brigadier General Steve Zemeckis, and he made the point that some of the people who we've rounded up and we call low-level terrorists were so young and so unattached from having any impact on our national security that it's kind of akin to the way we create moral panic about African-American males who are at the bottom chain of drug sales. So the kid who's selling, a nickel bag on the street is akin to these low-level young people, some of whom were as young as 13 and 16 who were picked up when they were put in Guantanamo. So it's this moral panic that gets unleashed about the other. And relatedly is the Islamophobia. It cannot be divorced from these programs. Some of the tactics used by the interrogators have sort of taken on, they've invoked holy wars and crusaders and that sort of thing. So those are points that I think are really critical for us to consider domestically as we go forward. But finally, let me just tell you about this commission. What are victims owed? What's an effective remedy? What's reparation? They're owed fair and adequate compensation required by law. They're owed pecuniary and non-pecuniary compensation, more specifically. They're entitled to rehabilitation for their psychological and physical harm. They're entitled to an investigation of their suffering and to have their tormentors prosecuted and punished. They have the right to truth, and they have the right to an appropriate public and political apology. And these entitlements are linked to the very right to justice. So our current efforts include this commission, And so it's a blue ribbon commission. It's respected, it's diverse, it's visible, seeking official transparency for North Carolina's involvement. The witnesses that are scheduled to provide testimony include Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Thomas, who's an active U.S. Air Force and counsel to 2 Guantanamo detainees, Alberto Moroff, who's the former General Counsel to the U.S. Navy, Mark Jacobson, who's a former staffer for the State Armed Services Committee, and others including Mohamedou Al-Slahi, who's a former Guantanamo detainee and an author, and more. So I hope that you will consider attending these hearings. They're public. They're going to be held at the Raleigh Convention Center November 30th and December 1st. If you look at the website, you can get more information about the hearings. They will be live streamed as well. So I'm happy to answer any other questions, and I'm sorry because I bet I went on a little too long.
Weissman, thank you very much for shedding light into this more arcane area that's usually not so headline-grabbing in our media than the other side of the terrorist attacks. And I was reminded of what Bruce Weissman pointed out yesterday in his keynote speech, that one goal, and maybe the main goal of terrorists, is to provoke governments, is to provoke democratic liberal states into illiberal reactions. or overreactions or into panic. And this was true with the Red Army faction in Germany during the ideological, secular terror of the 1970s, as much as it seems to be true with the religiously motivated terror. And your presentation and your story made me wonder if, in part, they really have succeeded in provoking otherwise liberal and rule of law and people-loving societies into an overreaction, into a panic, illiberal reaction. It reminded me of Helmut Schmidt, the German chancellor during the Red Scare in Germany, when he insisted that any terrorist, in that case the Red Army faction terrorists, would be treated as any other criminal through the legal justice system, period. That he would not be provoked into taking extraordinary warlike measures. Of course, if you have a war, then you have martial law, and then the kind of rule of law and liberal regime inside is somehow unhinged. And it seems we are in between that. And I would like to open up to the audience and our, I think, 40 minutes or so of questions we can raise with our experts on the panel by posing that question. Do you think this one goal of the terrorists has been at least in part been achieved, provoking us into illiberal responses?
Well, I think that we have responded illiberally and illegally. Whether I would put the blame entirely on the notion of provocation, I'm not quite sure about that. But certainly that's where we've landed. And it's, again, reading the description of Bergdahl's torture. He was kenneled, he was in a small box. It was so similar in so many ways, for example, to the torture that al-Nashiri, who's the alleged mastermind of the USS Cole's torture, that it seems that provocation in whole or in part, we have wound up doing what our enemies do.
I don't want to hijack completely our open discussion, but there's one last point. The police chief of Frankfurt was made to resign just a few years ago in a very recent abduction case. A young man abducted a little boy, and the police thought he knew where the boy was still held, that the boy was still alive. So the police chief threatened something like torture. And because of that utterance, he was fired. There was no actual torture going on. Later it turned out the boy was dead already. It's a story that jumped to mind immediately when we talk about torture as a means of maybe saving other people's lives, right? And making these kind of trade-offs. I know the Israeli government, when I was in Berlin, lobbied very hard on accepting this kind of idea that if you can save other lives, you're allowed to use extraordinary measures. I'm sorry, I'm the chair. I should not get worked up about anything of this kind. Therefore, I open up the floor to questions. If you are up in front, please come speak into the microphone, then you will be recorded. Otherwise, just speak up. Yes, Stephen.
Hi, Dr. Dauber. I have a question about kind of measuring the efficacy of sort of these counter-narratives and CVE programs, just because it seems kind of nebulous almost and difficult to do. So is there any data on their efficacy, and if so, how is it obtained?
So, what I was making reference to was with the Think Again, Turn Away campaign. I mean, I'm just looking at the fact that during the course of that campaign, the number of foreign fighters just kept cranking. As private groups have started to do CVE, they're investigating on their own different types of metrics. Which we think is critical. And if you're going to do CVE, you've got to come up with some way to do metrics to go along with your program. I think all of those different types of metrics are kind of new at this point. So it's going to be a couple of years before we have some way to assess what NGO groups are doing in terms of that. which is sort of a non-answer, but I don't have a good answer for you.
Susan, can you take the microphone? Otherwise, it's difficult to understand.
So, as governments have failed spectacularly as CVE, increasingly NGOs are starting to pick up those programs. And there are many, many different NGOs doing many, many different things in CVE. And many of them understand that they've got to come up with some kind of metrics to evaluate what they're doing. But all of this is so new that I'm not familiar with anybody who has, as of yet, published substantive, elaborate, extensive metrics on what they've done. Partially because the downside of having NGOs do this is that for the most part their scale is very small. So it's just going to be a little bit before we have any usable, extensive, elaborate metrics for that. Does that make sense?
I think I can be loud enough. And this is to you, Dr. Dauber. Do we have any information about how effective this kind of propaganda is? Supposing you start with 1,000 men between ages of 15 and 40 of Arab or Muslim background of some kind, and what proportion actually run across this stuff, what proportion become repeated viewers, what proportion move beyond that and try to get in touch with an active group, and then how many actually end up in Syria or, you know, some active domestic terrorist plot.
So one thing I would say is right off the bat, it's not just a question of Arab or Muslim, because these groups attempt to recruit outside those boundaries. In fact, from what has leaked of their own sort of HR documents, they would almost, the less devout a Muslim you are, even to the point of maybe not being Muslim, the better a potential recruit you are for them, because it means you're sort of a blank slate. So they can tell you whatever they want to tell you about Islam and manipulate the information, and you won't know that you're being manipulated in terms of the substance of the information. That said, so here's the thing. It is not the case that simply looking at videos is going to radicalize you. The number of people who are quote-unquote self-radicalized is very small. So for example, the guy in New York City who drives down the pedestrians, right? It looks right now as if he was self-radicalized. That's a relatively rare case. It's also the case that you can look at a whole bunch of videos and not be radicalized. Case in point, Mark Robinson and myself, we've probably watched more hours of this crap than anybody else, and you know, we're still here. Now, there's an extensive debate as to whether that means that the videos matter at all, which I don't get, right? People make the argument, well, if just watching the videos won't radicalize you, why are we even talking about the videos? Because really it takes an online component. You've got to meet somebody who pulls you in and blah, blah. Okay, but when you meet that person, it's not like you meet that person and then they take you bowling. What do you think the person you meet does? They take you back and show you the videos. It's a complex process we don't fully understand. It has an online component and an offline component. So part of the issue is to do proper, robust research would require full access to a population nobody has full research access to. So we've got to do, this is an incredibly unsatisfying answer, I realize. You've got to do proxies for, you know, I can't survey that population. How can I come up with workarounds for the fact that I don't have full access to that population? I realize that's an incredibly unsatisfying answer, but that's sort of where we're at right now.
Well, I mean, don't the internet companies have some record of who watches what? I mean, if they really wanted to go...
Oh, like they're going to tell you the truth about anything. Yeah. I mean, they're just lying about this. Sorry, this is being recorded. let's for legal purposes say that I have my suspicions about how accurate they're being and what they're really telling us. I'm sure they have records of everything, but I'm sure they could also pull the crap down in a heartbeat if they wanted to. For some reason, they seem not interested in doing that. So I'm not looking to them for help in this matter. Please don't sue me, whoever's watching this.
Let me know.
Again, a question directed at Dr. Dauber. I found that fascinating. I wanted to actually get your view on a comment made by the head of MI5, who said that the biggest worry for him, looking at the internal security situation in the UK and the Islamist threat that he sees there, is that the process of radicalisation, he said, is speeding up exponentially. And flash to bang, they're finding that people are moving much more quickly from being passive observers to willing participants, to the point that they're willing to actually sacrifice their own lives. And I guess this ties into the bigger debate about radicalisation, but most of it seems to centre on the internet and individuals looking at these visual images that you've just sort of highlighted. And so, given what you've just said, I mean, you're talking about something which is a much more balanced set of reasons, but the view of the British security services seems to zero in on this particular medium as being the principal facilitator and catalyst for this. I just wondered what your view of that was.
So consider whether it's self-radicalization or you are meeting a person who is showing you the videos. Think about the difference in the last 10 or 15 years. First of all, think about the quality difference, right? So remember that Taliban video I showed you. It's not HD, it's grainy. The guy's pointing the camera all over the place. And then think about what I'm calling the Islamic State tourism video, right? Where it's lovingly edited, it's beautifully lit, right? So it's a quality difference. The quality of equipment that you can buy for the price, right? These groups can now buy equipment that will get them incredibly high level stuff for a fraction of the cost, right? I mean, GoPros, what's a GoPro cost? Right, so just what you can do now for very low level cost and for very little training, there's no comparison. And then it's the very fact of the internet and social media. So even if it requires a person to show you the right video and to have a conversation with you framing what you're seeing, none of that was available 10 or 15 years ago. So it makes sense to me that, right, that there's a speed up of the process because what's available has changed the game, I think, just in the time we've been looking at what's been going on. Does that make sense?
It does, but I wonder as well, how far and to what extent is it about the content, the message that is being conveyed? Not just in terms of it's really sexy. It kind of reminds me of an army recruitment advert, to be honest with you.
Oh yeah.
The images that are there, and I can understand why it would appeal to a particular sort of demographic.
Yeah.
And it's quite clever, in fact, that they're doing it that way. I wasn't conscious of the sort of idea of targeting youth culture.
Yeah.
But is it also the way in which Islamic State sells itself? You know, they don't seem to be interested in having deep, meaningful debates. I mean, there was a point made by Bruce Hoffman last night in this conversation that they're having. It isn't about the deeper theological points and the rights and wrongs of what they're doing. It is just basically about a sort of visceral hatred of the other, and this idea you can have a really good time.
Wow. So Charlie Winter at King's has done some incredibly sophisticated work in the categories of video that they produce, right? But if you look at Al-Qaeda stuff, and this is true today, their stuff is some guy sitting, talking to the camera for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Sophisticated points of ideology. Blah, 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 blah. It'll bore the crap out of you. I mean, they go on and on and on and on. And I don't think that this is not a bash of millennials, this is just a statement about millennials. And everybody in the room who's a college professor is going to nod when I say this. They ain't going to listen to you babble on about nothing for an hour and a half. It's just not who they are. They want some sexy crap up on the screen, right? So Al-Qaeda's going to lose just at that level when you start showing the editing from the one I showed where it was like image. That's how you grab millennials. And Islamic State just does not get into sophisticated nuance of message in the same way. It's not that there's not a message there. There is a message there, but they're selling the message through the sophisticated way that the images come across, we think.
Yeah, so style over substance.
It's substance through style. How about that? But they just, I've never seen an Islamic State video where there's just some guy lecturing for an hour and a half. They never do that I've ever seen.
No, thank you, it's very good.
That's the big difference between the text-based radicalization of the Red Army faction of the 1970s and very brainy, educated, upper-class people.
Yeah.
I saw a hand at the end of the room. Yes?
I just want to switch to the other end of the table. I'm wondering about whether there are inconsistencies of definition in relation to conventions on torture, for instance. I'm coming from, there was a talk here by Marcus on the definition of anti-Semitism, who points out that the European Commission, the British, the Americans, the French, have technically different definitions, but they're not too far off. They mean the same things, but they don't say it the same way. Secondly, there was a Swedish speaker who pointed out that the Geneva Convention actually came out of the Russian intelligentsia setting up something for managing non-combatants in Galicia. So I just wonder if you are finding that you're bridging at different levels, aside from overt deception, non-cooperation, non-compliance, whether you run into any disjunctions between ostensibly equivalent statements.
So yes, in our reservations, understandings, and declaration with regard to the Convention Against Torture, we have somewhat differently defined torture, but not sufficiently to impact the fact that even under our somewhat different definition, what we've done is illegal. And then it's hard to say whether that RUD would stand given the various federal statutes put together. So I think at the end of the day, with regard to CAT, we would be able to reach a domestic definition that would be on all fours with the international definition. And in addition to the reservations, understandings, and declarations, and in addition to the terminology in the convention, there is a very basic understanding of what torture is found in customary international law. So I don't think that there's any meaningful deviation.
Ma'am, I have a question about referring to the torture. You quoted some tail numbers for aircraft that may have been state aircraft or state locations, and you call them torture taxis. But what makes you come upon that assumption that there are being torture taxis? I mean, as far as personnel on board, or there's a roster of who's on the aircraft, the to and from locations, and then there was a following legal piece behind that. And the second part of the question is, you did say that everybody from the governor on down to the local authorities, I may have missed what it was that you were trying to ask them, because you talked about who you were trying to get an answer from, but they've been non-compliant. So I was just, what is it that you were trying to get from them?
Thank you, especially for the last question. Yeah, with regard to the tail numbers, so I didn't coin the term torture taxis, but it does seem, given what I've been reading in all of our interviews, it seems like an apt description. I think Jane Mayer came up with that term, but With regard to the plane tail numbers, they've been obtained through the Council of Europe's flight data, FAA flight data, and plane spotters. So I don't think there's much doubt about those tail numbers and where the planes fly out of and where they fly to. And I'm happy to show you the documentation afterwards, and so you can see that. What are we asking for when we meet with these public officials? I'm going to speak for myself, because although I've been working with grassroots organizations on this, I'm not sure that we all have a unified view. I'm asking for, first and foremost, an acknowledgement of what happened, because actually the survey of victims, both our own and through the Constitution Project, the #1 request that they would like to see in terms of reparation is a public acknowledgement and apology. So that's my #1 goal. Sometimes I think it's my only goal. With regard to state officials, I would like for them to see an investigation. I would like for them to really air in a public and transparent way what happened. This might sound a little strange, and I know I'm being recorded. I have not personally, and again, I'm only speaking for myself, thought that prosecution is a solution. I might get to that point after transparency and investigation, but focusing on what I know would be the most meaningful and how difficult it is to obtain that, I'm just focused on apology. And so acknowledgement and apology, that's what I think our main goal has been.
Dr. Miller or Professor Miller? Doctor? I didn't get your line. Dr.
I'm going to say I'm not a real doctor.
Thanks for reminding us that it's important to look at the effects past policies have had on current security dynamics. It's important to always look back and see if mistakes were made. In your argument, I heard you say a few times both sides, and I think you summed up your argument. You said the current state terrorist dynamic is a confrontation, and correct me if I don't want to misstate your word. It's a confrontation between, on the one side, religious ideologues, and then Western secular states that are with spiritually inspired passion. Is that correct? So, from my, at least, untrained ear, it sounded a lot like you were saying, and I hate to rehash this term, there's been violence on both sides. So I'm wondering if you can clarify your argument a little bit. Are you saying that the violence used by Western states, which inherently, because their states have a monopoly on the use of violence, and the violence used by terrorists to achieve political goals are equivalent? Are you drawing an equivalence between those two different uses of violence?
Yes, that's a very profound question, and deserves a much better answer than I'm probably going to give you right now. It's not equivalent so much as engagement and entanglement that I'm trying to get at. It's the there can't be a battle unless you've got an enemy, and the enemy can be designed, created, or be real. I mean, the point is that there's a link and a connection between the two. It's not equivalent, I think, because the state, as you correctly point out, always has the advantage. Ever since Max Weber reminded us of the necessity of the state to possess weaponry that we as citizens or our enemies can never have. So I don't think it's equivalence, but I'm convinced, from at least the perspective of historical case studies, that there's an entanglement. I'll give you one small example from that's probably quite obvious. Stalin eventually ran out of enemies, so he created them. Poets. Imagine being threatened. Imagine a powerful state being threatened by poets, and he was, and they were punished. So I'm not sure that helps explain the thing. So again, it's not the word equivalence, but rather the entanglement. Militants can't fight unless we fight back, and we can't fight them unless we do it. So that's all I'm trying to get at. That's not a very sophisticated answer, but my book's online.
If you permit me to follow up on your question, of course, Stalin then tried to turn the poet into the engineers of the soul, right? Making them to fall into the line of the rank and file engineers. Your definition, let's say, I think you said at the heart of terrorism lies a contestation over the legitimacy of authority in a state. And that authority and the legitimacy of that authority can be contested and questioned in many ways. It can be questioned through non-violence, from Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela eventually. And it can be contested in violent ways. And in this sense, terrorism would just be a certain tool, a certain means. And it's not a thing, a theory of itself, but it's just a toolkit, usually of the weaker guerrilla kind of warfare forces. So would you say, if contestation on the legitimacy of authority is at the root of terrorism, whether one takes the terrorist route or the non-violent route or other routes is a matter of choice?
Yes, in fact, I just started, this is not an advertisement, just part of an answer, I invented a course last semester. I taught it for the first time at Duke, and I will try and repeat it in the spring. It's called The History of Political Nonviolence. It speaks directly to alternatives to terrorism and violence, to break the entangled connection between the two sides. I think that there are also, I'm learning this as I go, there are many more historical examples of this happening than I had realized. That doesn't, however, explain I'm trying to think of the correct word. There's almost a need for those people who engage in violence to solve their political problems about legitimacy that way. Sure, there's plenty of examples of this, but what we all strive and I think agree to achieve is to find peaceful ways to resolve intractable conflicts rather than engaging in horrifying violence, which is, to my mind, committed far more demonstrably by states in historical perspective than by militants, which doesn't excuse the other side, but again, simply speaks to the entanglement nature of it.
This is a question to you, Mr. Milner. You have a very Eurocentric view of this whole terrorism business. The vast majority of terrorist acts and lethal deaths in the last 20 years is between various Sunni, Shia, Muslim Brotherhood against Arab State, just even going back some 20-some years, the Muslim Brotherhood against Algeria, the Algerian military, and 50 to 100,000 people were wiped out. So are we stuck in this frame of just us Westerners against others? Or is this something that happens on a much larger scale, but we're not going to deal with it at this conference? I mean, are we going to limit ourselves to just the what Western states experience in terms of opposition, terrorist opposition? I'm just wondering what the framework is here.
It's transnational, international, globalized, just as so many phenomena that we live with today are. I hadn't thought of myself as Eurocentric, but I suppose since my training and my languages are in that part of the world, so yes, maybe my orientation is excessively such. But the problems that you're raising are real, and they're a planet worldwide. They really are. But all I'm trying to argue here is that wherever one goes with these issues, you'll find that kind of entanglement. You'll find the two sides in combat with each other over questions of political legitimacy, one way or the other. One side doesn't respect the legitimacy goals of the other, and vice versa. That seems to what is the case. It's always there. Regardless of the form of government, it doesn't matter whether it's a democratic republic or some totalitarian autocracy. The problem is the same one. And what's happening as a result of that is underneath, the real issues that generate the problems of return to violence in the first place are being ignored. And that's the pity and the crime of the whole thing.
I think your question was about the numbers, right? The numbers in the West of victims of terrorism is minuscule to the numbers in other countries, I think. But we are looking at the effects here, right? Stalin would say 1 death was a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistics. And you might say that the media is dominated by Western media, and the texts here just carry much more weight as far as headline-grabbing effects. I saw other questions. Yes?
A second question, following on the Brexit question, which seemed to me to be in part an ideological one, Britain wanting to be somehow severed from European unity. My understanding is that Brexit is not really serving the economic interests of its strongest supporters, say elderly and formerly industrialized cities in England. And I wonder how that compares to the terrorist ideological persuasion. Not that the Brexiteers are terrorists. The deeper question I'd like to ask about is what level of responsibility is required or expected of ensembles of what size? Terrorists are obviously not accountable. Sit beneath the woodwork, so they're not founders. But I mean, if you look at gun control, the Second Amendment doesn't actually say that individuals in the United States can carry guns. It says that militias can carry guns. There's a certain implicit responsibility and accountability of states of certain sizes, be it cities, states, or the national governments that make the level of force that they can apply accountable. So I'm wondering, particularly in Brexit, to what extent there's a manipulation or whether there's an ideology being sold, and how that compares to terrorism.
Does anyone feel the calling to answer the question that links the Brexit and terrorism and if not, of course, the new politics of nativism that we have observed throughout Western Europe and in North America might be such a nexus. Right?
I'm following on the question of this gentleman here.
I was going to, yeah, sorry. I think it's a really difficult question to answer. And the best answer I think that I can give you that links terrorism to Brexit is, I think one of the things that actually caused or precipitated Brexit was the sense of existential crisis that emerged in Europe as you began to see a flood of refugees pouring out from Syria and by various routes through Turkey, across the Mediterranean, etc., infiltrating into Europe, and the sense that actually there was a loss of control and the fear that this migration would actually eventually come home to roost in the UK. And all of this, I think, became more increasingly problematic because the European Union declared, and it was entirely fair and reasonable to do this, that there should be a fair allocation and distribution of those refugees across the European Union as a whole. And a number of states took issue with this, the most notorious being Hungary and the way in which it treated refugees and tried to make sure that it closed its borders to them. But that sense of crisis, I think, fed into the sort of primal fears of many British citizens. And that, combined with the sense of economic crisis that existed within Europe at that time, with the perceived failure of the euro and the huge debt that states like Spain and Italy had, combined to blend to create this toxic logic which suggested the answer to the exam question was to pull the plug and close the Channel Tunnel down, pull up the drawbridge, and basically say wave but goodbye to Europe and move on to somewhere else. Now, sadly, I think a number of people within the UK hijacked that particular fear, and in particular the UKIP, UK Independence Party, which were the sort of prime force that drove the Brexit agenda. And you had people in UKIP, in spite of the leader, Nigel Farage, on a number of occasions denying that there was any sort of racism or securitization of Muslim communities by his party. A whole host of people in the UKIP party basically claiming and demanding that these people were in fact terrorists. And that was helped to some extent by the propaganda put forward by Islamic State, which effectively said, we are infiltrating Europe through these refugees and we will use them to carry out attacks against your country. So all of that, I think, served to raise the issue of terrorism and to shape policy in a completely bizarre sort of way. So there is a connection that is there. I don't think it was the most salient reason why people decided to actually vote yes, we wish to leave the European Union. There are a variety of factors, but it certainly was at play, I think, amongst a particular demographic within the United Kingdom.
So terrorism is one ingredient of the existential threat perception, terror meaning fear, that then drives otherwise liberal and moderate nations into becoming maybe nativist and maybe more illiberal. So one success of provocation, I think Bruce Hoffman might call it. I have a question for Professor Dauber. When I saw your videos and your analysis of the aesthetics of those videos, I was immediately reminded of my time in the German high school when we studied also Leni Riefenstahl's videos of the 1936 Olympics and how well they were done and how much she would set the standard for any future kind of propaganda videos, first for Goebbels but then also for the rest of the world, including FDR, Roosevelt, in the United States, which made me think of the quality of propaganda seems to be a weapon. It's a weapon in the hands of the good guys or the bad guys, or anybody in between. I think most might be in between. And the question is, how can one control this weapon? Taking it down would be one way from the one side or the other side. Or is it a symptom of the aesthetization of politics? You said style is substance. You said style is substance, and this then generates a mass appeal. Mentioning ripping of very popular video games, what is it called, Call of Duty, superhero movies. This is the kind of mass appeal through the aesthetization of politics. But the hardcore is probably radicalized on textual basis, whether it's the Russian anarchists of the 19th century, self-radicalized on textual basis, or the Red Army faction in Western Europe. So do you see a link between the Riefenstahl-Goebbels aesthetic propaganda, aesthetization of politics, was taken up by Western governments later and now by terrorists, and how to counter that or how to defuse that weapon?
I show clips in my class of Triumph of the Will especially. I mean, she invented, if you don't study this stuff, Leni Riefenstahl has been called Hitler's director. This is a woman that he used to make the largest, most important propaganda films for the Nazi Party. And she invented techniques that are used down through today, not only by propagandists, documentarians, but people you would recognize immediately like Steven Spielberg. Something as simple as keep the crowd still and have the people with the cameras move past the crowd, right? I mean, this is stuff that, I mean, when you look at her films, they look a little cheesy and dated because they're from 1936, but the techniques have been used down to this day. Now, you say the hardcore are radicalized through text, but the kids are all on Instagram. So don't presume that that's going to be true in 5, 10, 15 years, because they speak a visual language and they're much more fluent and adept at it than we are because they spend all their time on visual platforms and mediums. So it seems to me that the most important thing, we spend so much time and such care teaching them a fluency in assessing and understanding text and criticism and critique and evidence. And we don't take the same time and care and effort in teaching them how to understand, unpack, and speak the visual language that they spend all their time with. They have got to be able to understand how the materials that are visual are put together and used to manipulate and build and assess and persuade. Because they spend their time on the visual platforms at least as much as on the textual platforms. And we are derelict in that we do not spend the same care in teaching them how those platforms are used to persuade and communicate.
We have time for a final question. This usually scares everybody. No, please.
Yeah, just I noticed last night, similar theme from Bruce Hoffman's speech to today about not allowing the corrosion of our core values as a nation. So I just wondered, something that you said, Professor Dauber, is a theme that also kind of popped up last night about basically as a form of fear, I guess. We're a lot more likely to kind of sell some of our personal rights, personal privacy, for the trade-off of additional security. And there seems to be right now a strong movement to kind of like allow Facebook or Google having access to, okay, what are people looking at, and allowing the government access to that can be kind of a slippery slope. In creating terrorist watch lists because, say, for example, someone took your class and has been analyzing ISIS videos, and all of a sudden they're popping up on hot lists every time they go to the airport. So I'm wondering where this panel views that trade-off of privacy versus security.
The thing he said last night that I thought was so true. Everybody's freaked out about the surveillance state in the NSA. I'm scared of Google and Facebook. And all of y'all that are so scared about the NSA will log on to Foursquare. Is it Foursquare, right? It's the one where you tell people where you're at all the time. And as soon as you can afford it, you buy OnStar for your cars. Are you crazy? What do you think OnStar is, man? You're telling those companies exactly where you are every second of the day. Amazon. All those ads pop up. You liked this, maybe you like this too. I don't want those companies knowing anything about me. The first thing you do when you get a phone is disable all the. If I lose my iPhone, I lose my iPhone. I'm out an iPhone. I can live with that. What I can't live with is Apple knowing where I am, because I don't trust Apple. And then I don't care if you stream that, because I'm willing to say publicly, Apple, I don't trust you.
We're not going to start our late night confessions here.
Final comments?
Of course. Late night confessions. Final comments. I start on those.
Sure. So I would say that it would be useful for people to really debunk the whole myth of the ticking time bomb and to understand the ways in which torture, even as an instrumentality, doesn't provide any real measure of counterterrorism success. That was the conclusion of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, and the experts repeat that over and over. But again, it comes down to it's illegal. And it's a slippery slope. Once we begin to think that torture is necessary or possible in this isolated case, we institutionalize it. We become a bureaucracy of torturers. And I think that that might be one of the worst outcomes we could possibly produce from the circumstances we face with groups from ISIS to Al-Qaeda to other terrorist groups. The other question, I think, is that we never really address the huge issues that underlie and create the determinants for what we see, and they're certainly beyond my expertise. If we were to think about the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunnis and the Shias, it doesn't start with that particular conflict either. To figure out how far back to go is something that we probably will never be able to accomplish, but we could at least attempt to think about it. I teach a class on gender violence, and I tell my students, people are either hatched somehow with violent tendencies, in which case they probably have organic brain disease, and we should be spending some resources on cures and mental health, or else they're a product of circumstances. When we think about individual choices, what does that mean for people who are isolated, for people who are poor, for people who can't get medical care, for people who can't get meaningful education? What does it mean for people who are humiliated because of the color of their skin or because of their religion? Those kinds of circumstances constrain individual choice. And it's very macro and it's very micro. I don't think we'll ever be able to accomplish looking at the broad concentric circles that produce the circumstances we find ourselves in, but we don't even attempt to do so. I think that there's some permanence to the circumstances we face, but that doesn't mean we don't try to do the right thing. And if we try to do the right thing, however ironic or I don't know if ironic is the right word, but however contradictory it might be to say we're in a permanent situation, but yet we should continue to try to do the right thing. It's how we recreate ourselves as human beings. And that's the irony, that's how change is made. So that might be a little bit too philosophical and 35,000 feet up, but we really have no choice but to try to live out humanity. And oftentimes that humanity is reflected in the law. Torture is illegal.
Nothing can be too deep or too philosophical. Oh, I just wanted to thank my co-panelists because as a historian, I've just learned a lot today, and I'm grateful to them for providing that information. For those of us who live in the past, my only advice is, and I think probably we all feel this way in one way or another, is to exercise a sense of morality in our decisions and be very aware of control over us and over the people in the world. That's true. You did everybody.
So those were called to duty, as moral duty, or high aspirations, high aims. We spent quite some topics on this panel. It's not easy to really put a bracket among all of those, but I think we had a very stimulating presentations and questions and discussions, and now we should all have enough food for thought and ready to get some food for our stomachs, which is where?
Downstairs.
Where downstairs? It's downstairs. We're gonna find it. We're gonna sniff it out. Okay, enjoy your lunch break.
Thank you very much.